the official version, the one in the Poem of Pentaur, and the colossal statues and the solar alignment and the name on every surface that could hold it, presents a figure of unchallengeable greatness, a god confirmed by the sun itself, a warrior who prevailed at Kadesh through divine favour, a builder whose works speak for themselves across the millennia. The language his scribes wrote in required centuries of extraordinary scholarly effort to decode after knowledge of how to read it was lost. The gods whose names appear in the sanctuary at Abu Simbel are no longer worshipped by any living community. They were taking care of it when the priests who hid his mummy at Deir el Bahari were themselves already centuries dead. They are taking care of it tonight. Somewhere on the other side of the world from wherever you are lying in the dark. The temple waiting in the Egyptian night for the morning when the sun will rise at the right angle and the light will begin its 60. Meet a journey. One more time. The geometry of the building and the path of the sun take care of it. They have taken care of it. Despite one extraordinary modern relocation. Across the long span of everything that followed the original construction. They were still taking care of it when the knowledge of how to read the inscriptions on the walls had been lost and had not yet been recovered. Not because anyone maintains the alignment, not because anyone performs the demonstration or keeps the tradition or passes the knowledge from one generation to the next. On the mornings in February and October, when the alignment occurs, the light still travels the full length of that corridor and finds the same surfaces it has always found, and illuminates the same 3 statues, while Ptah remains in the dark. The 4 colossal figures on the facade are not rubble. They are standing, carved from the cliff, looking east across the Nile Valley in the early morning, as they have looked east for more than 3,000 years. The temple behind them still extends 60 meters into the rock. The corridor still leads to the innermost sanctuary. The sanctuary still holds the 4 figures in the positions they were placed in, and twice a year. It is a good poem. It is saying something true about the relationship between ambition and time. But here is what it did not anticipate. The actual Abu Simbel is not a ruin in an empty desert. The poem imagines a ruin in an empty desert. The work's gone, the king gone, the inscription surviving only to make the emptiness around it more eloquent. The whole point of the poem is that contrast. The gap between the boast and the silence around it, between the command to despair and the fact that there is nothing left to despair at. The irony is the message, the ambition produced. In the end, only a more beautiful demonstration of its own failure, the version that emerges from reading all the evidence, including the parts he did not control, is more complicated and in some ways more interesting, a man of real ability and real limitation, of genuine achievement and a pattern of over, claiming that the independent sources make difficult to ignore, of something that may have been genuine feeling, expressed in a temple for a woman whose name the inscription says, "The sun rises to honour," of a body that spent its last decades bent with arthritis, its teeth gone, its arteries hardening, while the stone showed him upright and perfect and beyond the reach of time. But the temple at Abu Simbel is something beyond even that extraordinary tomb. That was, as this entire story has traced, the project underneath the project, the thing that ran beneath all of it like the corridor runs beneath the cliff at Abu Simbel, leading toward the place where the light is designed to fall. He is remembered. What is less clear, and what makes his story worth spending a night with, is whether the version of himself that is remembered is the version he designed, and the name he pressed into everything is still there. Still the first name most people who know anything about ancient Egypt think of when they think of ancient Egypt. Still generating the kind of attention that simple stories about simple people do not generate. Because there is enough complexity in the evidence to keep the questions open across 3,000 years and counting. He wanted to be remembered. The pharaohs whose names he removed from stone have been recovered by scholars who found the evidence beneath the replacements or in other surviving records. They have their names back. Akhenaten, whose memory the 19th dynasty worked systematically to erase, is among the most studied figures in all of Egyptology. The people he tried to remove from the record have, in the long run, not been removed. There is a name carved into more stone than almost any other name from the ancient world. Not written, carved, with chisels and hammers, by hands that worked in heat and dust, pressing deep into surfaces that had already stood for centuries before those hands arrived. The name appears on temple walls the length of the Nile Valley, on obelisks, on colossal statues, on cliff faces cut open to hold it. It appears in places you would expect and in places that will surprise you, including surfaces where other names had been before it, names that were removed to make room. The name is Ramses. The question underneath everything tonight is not simply who he was, it is something harder, a man who controls every inscription written about him, who commissions every image and approves every account, leaves behind a version of himself. But that version and the truth of who he actually was are not necessarily the same thing, and the distance between them, in this particular case, turns out to be one of the most fascinating spaces in all of ancient history. Tonight is a long story. Let it come to you one part at a time. Ramses the Second was not born into an ancient and unbroken line of kings. That is the right place to begin, because it changes how you read almost everything that came after. The scale of the building programs, the name pressed into surface after surface across the full length of Egypt and beyond, the commissioned poetry describing him as a god among men, the battle accounts wide enough to take minutes to walk past. When you understand where his family actually came from, all of that insistence begins to look like something more complicated than ordinary royal confidence. The dynasty he belonged to, what scholars of ancient Egypt call the 19th dynasty, was not old. His grandfather, the man who first took the name Ramses and ruled as Ramses the First, had not been born into royalty. He had been a military officer, a general named Paramessu who served loyally under a pharaoh named Horemheb. And when Horemheb reached the end of his reign without a son to succeed him, he chose this general as his heir, not because of sacred bloodline, not because of divine inheritance reaching back through centuries of unbroken succession, because of competence and loyalty and the practical absence of a better option at a difficult moment. Ramses the First took the throne as an old man. He held it for perhaps 2 years before he died. 2 years is not enough time to build very much. What he did accomplish was establishing the line itself, passing the crown to his son in a transfer that looked, from the outside, like a continuation rather than another rupture. That son was Seti the First, and Seti the First was the father of the man this story is about. Think about what that means in terms of where Ramses the Second actually stood when he came into the world. His grandfather had been a soldier handed a crown late in life by a pharaoh who had no one else to give it to. His father was working to consolidate what that soldier had barely had time to secure. When Ramses the Second was born, the 19th dynasty had controlled Egypt for exactly 1 generation. 1 generation in a civilization that measured legitimacy in centuries. 1 generation in a culture where the right to rule was supposed to flow from unbroken divine bloodlines, connecting the living pharaoh to gods who had governed the world since the beginning of time. In that context, being new was not a small problem. It was the central problem, and everything the 19th dynasty chose to do, everything Seti the First built and fought and recorded, and everything Ramses the Second would spend the next 66 years doing, can be read partly as a response to that problem, not as proof of a psychological wound we cannot see inside, but as a pattern of behaviour that the evidence consistently produces when you look at it long enough and carefully enough to notice the shape it takes. Seti the First understood this with what appears to have been considerable clarity. The sources that survive from his reign, and we will talk carefully about those sources in the next chapter, suggest a ruler of genuine ability and strategic intelligence. He campaigned in the Near East, pushing Egyptian influence back into territories that had weakened during the turbulent decades before his family came to power. He fought in Libya. He conducted operations into Nubia. He built. The temple complex he commissioned at Abydos is considered by many scholars of this period to contain some of the finest relief carving produced during the entire New Kingdom. Work of a quality that speaks to serious artistic and religious investment, rather than mere official obligation. But Seti I was not simply ruling Egypt. He was making his family look like they had always been meant to rule it. He was constructing, in stone and paint and official record, an argument for legitimacy that the bloodline alone could not provide, and he began preparing his son for this same project before the son was old enough to fully understand what he was being prepared for. The surviving records, fragmentary and imprecise in the way ancient records tend to be, placed the young Ramses alongside his father during military campaigns at a very young age. The exact timing is not something the sources allow us to pin down with confidence. Some accounts suggest he was present during operations in Libya and the Near East when he was perhaps around 10 years old, though precision here would misrepresent what the evidence actually supports. What the records do suggest is a child, or a very young boy moving toward adolescence, accompanying the pharaoh into the field, not to fight, to be seen, to begin existing as a public figure in the minds of people who would matter enormously when the time came for authority to be his alone. He was also absorbing something specific during those early years, something that would become the organizing principle of his entire reign. He was learning that power and the record of power were not always the same thing, that the distance between what happened in the field and what was recorded about it was a distance that could be shaped. That shaping it was not a secondary concern. It was part of the work itself. This is not a psychological claim about what Ramses the Second felt or feared or needed. The sources do not give us access to that interior space, and anyone who offers it with confidence is offering something the evidence does not contain. What it is, held carefully and honestly, is an observation about what the pattern of his behavior suggests across 6 years of reign, a dynasty that needed legitimacy it had not inherited, a father who prepared his son systematically for the role of managing that need, a son who, when he came to power, pursued a program of construction and name, placement and commissioned self, celebration on a scale that had rarely been attempted. Why does a man who ruled for 6 years, still need to carve his name onto everything? That question does not have a clean answer, but it is the right question to carry into the rest of this story. When Seti I died, the full weight of Egypt passed to his son. The exact year is uncertain, as so much is uncertain in the chronology of this period. What is not uncertain is that the young man who stepped into power at that moment had been prepared for it more visibly and systematically than many pharaohs before him. He had watched. He had been watched. He had absorbed an education in the relationship between power and the performance of power that would shape everything he did for the rest of his extraordinarily long life. The dynasty was still young. The legitimacy problem was still present. The project his grandfather had started and his father had continued was not finished. Now it was his. There is a moment preserved in the official records of Seti I's reign, cut into stone with the careful attention that Egyptian royal scribes gave to anything they wanted to survive, in which the young Ramses is described not as a child accompanying his father on campaign, but as a commander, a military leader, a figure of authority standing alongside the pharaoh in the field. He was, by most reasonable estimates, somewhere around 10 years old. The gap between what the inscription says and what it almost certainly means is instructive, not because it reveals dishonesty. Exactly. Because it reveals how the world Ramses II was growing up inside worked, and what it understood power to be. Artin. Year. Old Boy is not a military commander in any meaningful operational sense. He does not direct troop movements or make tactical decisions under pressure, but a boy of that age who rides at the front of an army beside his father, who is formally designated as a participant in the campaign, who is seen by thousands of soldiers and court officials and foreign observers. That boy has done something real. He has begun to exist as a public figure. He has started accumulating the kind of presence in people's minds that a future pharaoh needs to have built up long before he actually becomes pharaoh. The inscription calling him a commander is not a lie. It is something more interesting than a lie. It is the official record performing the future, stating in stone what the young Ramses was being shaped to become, making his eventual authority feel like something that had always been present rather than something still under construction. He would spend the rest of his life doing the same thing on a much larger scale. The campaigns Ramses accompanied his father on during these early years covered real ground and faced real opposition. Seti I was not conducting ceremonial tours of Egyptian territory. he campaigned seriously in multiple directions, to the northeast, into the territory Egyptian sources called Canaan and Retjenu, where Egyptian influence had weakened during the complicated decades before the 19th dynasty, and where the presence of the Hittite Empire created a strategic tension that would define the central military challenge of his son's reign. To the west, against Libyan peoples pressing against Egypt's borders. To the south, into Nubia, where Egyptian authority needed to be maintained and demonstrated. These were not parades. The Egyptian army Ramses rode with was a professional force, moving through difficult terrain against opponents who did not want to be defeated. Chariotry and infantry and archers and the logistical systems required to keep thousands of soldiers supplied with food and water in environments that provided neither easily. The surviving records do not describe in detail what those early campaigns felt like from inside the column of march. From the perspective of a boy riding near his father through difficult country, what follows is a reconstruction drawn from the general context of New Kingdom military campaigns, rather than from a specific account of these particular journeys. The dust rising around leather and bronze, the sound of feet and hooves and chariot wheels on dry ground, the Pharaoh ahead, attended by officers and bodyguards, the apparatus of royal military command, visible and in motion, and nearby, in whatever position was appropriate for the designated heir. A boy watching, not the landscape, the people around him, learning how the presence of the Pharaoh changed the behavior of everyone in his vicinity. He was receiving an education that could not be replicated in any court classroom, not just in tactics. In what happened after the campaign ended, after each operation, the events of that operation were transformed. What had been experienced in dust and heat and the genuine uncertainty of military engagement became, in the official accounts, something with clean lines and predetermined meanings. The Pharaoh in his chariot, depicted larger than everyone around him, his enemies small beneath him. The victory described in terms that connected the outcome to divine will, to the sacred character of Egyptian kingship itself, the specific difficulty of particular engagements, the moments of confusion or near failure that every real campaign contains, absorbed into a narrative of inevitable royal triumph. The young Ramses was positioned to see both sides of this process. He had been in the field. He could watch the official record being made and understand from direct experience what the transformation involved. He could observe the distance between the event and the account of the event, not as an abstract problem, but as a concrete reality he had witnessed from both ends simultaneously. This is not a cynical observation about ancient Egyptian culture. Every society in every period produces official accounts of events that serve the needs of whoever controls their production. What made Ramses II's situation unusual was the combination of direct field experience and the position from which he observed the record making. He was not learning about this relationship secondhand. He was watching it happen to events he had personally witnessed. Egypt's court culture added further layers. The pharaoh in Egyptian royal ideology was not merely an administrator or a military commander. He was a sacred figure, the living embodiment of divine order, a bridge between the human world and the cosmic structures that sustained it. His physical body carried symbolic weight extending far beyond personal ability or achievement. The way he moved through a space, the way he was presented in official contexts, the way his image appeared in sculpture and relief. All of this was saturated with meaning that Egyptian audiences were trained from childhood to read and respond to. The young Ramses was growing into a figure of notable physical presence. The mummy examined centuries later gives us some physical information, though we should be careful about how precisely we interpret evidence that has passed through 3,000 years and the processes of ancient Egyptian preservation. The surviving physical record, together with the way he is depicted in the statuary produced during his reign, suggests a man of imposing height by the standards of his time and place. Whether this was something he cultivated consciously or simply the physical reality he was born with, it served the larger project of becoming a pharaoh who looked like a pharaoh before he was one. During the years between his first appearances on campaign and his accession to the throne, Ramses was given roles of increasing nominal authority, military commands with actual units under his formal designation, titles placing him unambiguously in the succession, presence at religious ceremonies where the relationship between the royal house and the divine order was publicly performed and observed. Each of these roles added something to the accumulating public image of a man being prepared for a specific kind of power, not preparation for private competence alone, for the ability to make good decisions in the administrative and military domains where a pharaoh's actual work happened. That preparation was certainly also occurring, but alongside it, woven through it, was preparation for public visibility, for being seen making decisions, for being understood by the audiences that mattered. As someone whose authority was natural and inevitable rather than recent and contested, power is not simply the ability to compel, it is the ability to be believed. A pharaoh whose decisions were right but whose presence was not believed in had less actual power than a pharaoh whose presence was overwhelming, regardless of the specific quality of individual decisions. Seti I knew this. He was teaching it to his son through direct experience rather than through instruction. The physical landscape of Egypt was itself part of this education. Moving through the Nile Valley, past the temples his father was building and the monuments that earlier pharaohs had left, Ramses could see what permanence looked like. He could see what it meant for a name to be cut into stone that would stand for centuries. He could see how the built environment carried the memory of power in ways that the living memory of any individual could never sustain. A name in stone did not die with the person who put it there. It continued, silently and without effort, making its argument to every person who passed it, for as long as the stone stood. That understanding, absorbed through direct experience rather than abstract instruction, would shape everything that follows in this story. Seti I died when his son was somewhere in his late teens or early 20s. The precise year is not recoverable from the surviving evidence. What is recoverable is the situation the young pharaoh stepped into, a kingdom that was powerful and capable and well administered, a dynasty that was still, by Egyptian standards, new, a legitimacy problem that had been addressed but not resolved, a project that had been begun but not completed. The project was now his to complete. He had been prepared for it more visibly and systematically than many pharaohs before him. He had watched. He had absorbed. He understood what his father had given him, and what the dynasty still needed, and what 6 years of reign would be spent doing about it. What he did is the rest of this story. Before this story moves into what Ramses II actually did, it needs to stop and say something honest about the ground we are standing on, not as a disclaimer to be gotten through before the real story can begin, as an invitation into what is itself one of the most interesting parts of the story. The question of how we know what we know about this particular man is not a dry methodological problem. It is close to the centre of everything, because the sources that survive about Ramses II are not simply incomplete in the ordinary way that ancient historical sources are incomplete. They are shaped, systematically and at enormous scale, by the priorities of the person they describe. Recognizing that shape, learning to read the evidence with awareness of how it was produced and why, is the difference between reading Ramses II and reading the version of Ramses II that Ramses II wanted you to read. Those are not the same thing. Much of what we know about this pharaoh comes from sources shaped by royal authority. That is a more precise statement than simply saying the sources are biased, because bias implies a deviation from some neutral baseline that in this case does not exist. There is no neutral account of him sitting somewhere waiting to be discovered. The record that survives was produced by a culture organized around royal power, and the most detailed and most widely distributed parts of that record were produced under direct royal commission. Understanding what each source is, where it came from, and what purposes it served is not optional background. It is the foundation. Begin with the most important source of all. The texts that scholars group under names including the Poem of Pentaur and the Bulletin of Kadesh are accounts of the Battle of Kadesh, the great confrontation between Egypt and the Hittite Empire around 1270, 4 BCU. The Poem of Pentaur is a literary composition written in the elevated register of Egyptian poetic tradition. describing the battle from the perspective of Ramses the Second and presenting him as a figure of extraordinary personal heroism guided by divine favour at the moment of maximum crisis. The Bulletin of Kadesh is a more documentary style account covering some of the same events with somewhat different emphasis. These texts are not rare. They are not preserved in a single archive or carved into a single wall. They appear on the walls of at least 5 major temple complexes. Among them, Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, Karnak, Luxor, and Abydos. Think about what that distribution means in practice. Imagine travelling through Egypt at any point during his reign. You visit Karnak because it is the most important religious site in the country, and everyone visits Karnak. The same account is there. You travel south to Luxor. The same account is there. You make the long journey to Abu Simbel. Cut into the cliff face in the far south. The same account is there. You travel to Abydos, one of the most sacred sites in Egyptian religious tradition. The same account is there. This was not record keeping. This was a communication strategy of a kind rarely matched in the ancient world. The same message, in every major public space simultaneously, shaping how every person who could read, or who heard it read aloud, understood what had happened at Kadesh and what kind of man their pharaoh was. The Poem of Pentaur is an invaluable source. It is detailed and vivid and tells us things about how Ramses the Second understood his own reign that we could not know from any other document. But it is not independent evidence. It is the official version, produced under royal commission, shaped by royal priorities, multiplied and distributed with royal resources. When we use it, we are using Ramses the Second's account of Ramses the Second. That is useful and genuinely fascinating. It is also something to hold at a carefully maintained distance. The Abydos king list, carved into a temple at Abydos during his reign, presents the succession of Egyptian pharaohs from the earliest dynasties down to his own time. It is one of the most important documents for understanding Egyptian royal history. It is also a curated document. Several rulers are absent from it, including the pharaohs of the Amarna period, the reign of Akhenaten, and those who immediately followed him. These absences were not accidental. They were choices, reflecting a particular understanding of which rulers counted as legitimate predecessors and which ones were better left out. The king list tells us what Ramses the Second considered proper Egyptian history. That is genuinely interesting information, but it is selected history, not neutral history. The inscriptions at Abu Simbel and at the Ramesseum are extensive. They record military campaigns, religious dedications, royal achievements. They have survived in remarkable condition given their age. They were also, every one of them, produced under direct royal authority and shaped by royal priorities. Now, here is where something changes. The clay tablets found at the site of ancient Hattusa, the Hittite capital in what is now central Turkey, give us something that none of the Egyptian sources can provide on their own. They give us the other side. The Hittites maintained written records. They kept archives of diplomatic correspondence and official accounts of their own activities. When those archives were excavated beginning in the early 20th century, they produced material covering some of the same events found in Egyptian sources, including Kadesh and the treaty that followed it, from a perspective that had no investment whatsoever in making Ramses II look good. The Hittite sources describe a battle that from their side looked like a successful defensive action rather than an Egyptian triumph. They describe a peace settlement that from their perspective was a negotiated agreement between powers who both had reasons to stop fighting. These tablets are the most important corrective tool available for reading his reign. When the Egyptian and Hittite accounts agree on something, we can have somewhat more confidence in that point. When they diverge, the divergence itself is information, telling us what each side needed the story to be and why. One additional source deserves mention here with care. The Harris Papyrus is a long document recording temple endowments and royal achievements, but it dates primarily to the reign of Ramses III and reflects the conventions of the Ramessid period more broadly, rather than providing direct biographical detail about Ramses II specifically. It is useful context for understanding how pharaohs of this dynasty typically presented themselves and their relationships with temples and gods. It should not be treated as a primary source for the specific events of his reign. Taken together, these sources give us a picture that is rich and detailed and worth many long nights of examination. It is also a picture in which the most abundant and most detailed material was produced by the subject of the picture, for the purpose of shaping how that picture was understood. There is a particular kind of attention this calls for, not skepticism in the sense of dismissing everything the official sources say, not credulity in the sense of accepting it uncritically, something more like the attention a careful reader gives to a letter written by someone who had strong reasons to present themselves in a particular light. You read what they say. You notice what they emphasize. You notice what they do not say. You look for the places where independent evidence either supports or complicates the account, and you try to hold both things at once. The account as it was constructed and the reality it was constructed to represent, keeping the gap between them visible rather than letting it close. Reading Ramses without recognizing that gap is reading him the way he wanted to be read. That gap is where this story lives. Not to tear down what he built, not to replace the official legend with a cynical counter. Legend that is equally one-sided in the opposite direction, but to find, in the space between what the sources were designed to tell us and what they reveal when read carefully, a figure who is more complex and more genuinely interesting than either the legend or its simple reversal. The sources he left behind are among the most elaborate systems of royal self-presentation that the ancient world produced. They are also, when read against the independent evidence of the Hittite tablets and the physical record that archaeology provides, a portrait of a man considerably more complicated than the portrait he commissioned. That gap is where we are going tonight. In the spring of 1270, 4 BCO, Ramses the Second led the Egyptian army north toward a city called Kadesh. He was in his mid-20s. He had been pharaoh for perhaps 5 years. He had already begun the work that would define his reign. The building, the name, placing, the systematic construction of a royal presence across the physical landscape of Egypt. But he had not yet done the thing that Egyptian royal tradition required above almost everything else. He had not yet demonstrated, in the field, against a serious opponent, that he was a warrior king in the tradition his audiences expected and his ideology demanded. Kadesh was going to be that demonstration. The city sat on the Orontes River in what is now western Syria, at a bend in the river that made it both defensible and strategically significant. It controlled access to trade routes and military corridors connecting Egyptian influence in Canaan with the broader landscape of the Near East. It had been contested ground between Egypt and its rivals for generations. Seti I had campaigned in the region, but the city itself remained within the sphere of the Hittite Empire. And the Hittite king, a man named Merneptah II, had no intention of surrendering that position simply because a new pharaoh had arrived on the Egyptian throne. Merneptah had prepared carefully, more carefully, it would turn out, than Ramses knew. The Egyptian army that moved north was organized into 4 divisions, each named for an Egyptian deity: the division of Amun, the division of Ra, the division of Ptah, the division of Set. This was not ceremonial organization. It was a practical system for moving a large force across long distances, maintaining command and communication while the army spread across the landscape of march. The total force was substantial, tens of thousands of men, chariotry and infantry and archers. With the logistical machinery required to keep that many soldiers functioning in the field across weeks of campaign, Ramses commanded the division of Amun personally. He was at the front. The Egyptian sources present him as moving with speed and confidence, pressing forward toward the objective. How much of that reflects actual events versus the literary conventions of Egyptian royal military narrative is something the sources do not allow us to fully separate. What the accounts agree on is that he advanced ahead of his supporting divisions at a pace that would shortly create a serious problem. The Hittites were not where he thought they were. As Ramses and the division of Amun approached Kadesh and established a camp to the north of the city, 2 men were brought to him, captured by Egyptian scouts. who presented themselves as deserters from the Hittite forces. They told him that the Hittite army was far to the north, near a city called Aleppo, not yet a threat, not yet close. On the basis of this intelligence, Ramses continued pressing forward. The two men were not deserters, they were agents, sent deliberately by Muwatalli to feed the Egyptian pharaoh false information about Hittite positions. The Hittite army was not at Aleppo, it was on the other side of Kadesh, concealed from Egyptian scouts, positioned exactly where it needed to be to strike the exposed Egyptian force at maximum disadvantage. Picture what the next hour looked like from inside the division of Ra. The division was still moving in column toward the camp Ramses had established. Soldiers strung out along the line of march, not deployed for battle, not prepared for impact. The Hittite chariotry came out from behind Kadesh and hit them while they were still moving. A force that has not had time to form for battle and is struck on its flank does not hold. The division of Ra broke. Soldiers fled north toward the Egyptian camp. The Hittite chariots followed them directly into it. What happened inside that camp in the minutes that followed is where the Egyptian and Hittite accounts diverge most dramatically, and where the question of what we can actually know becomes most important. The Egyptian account, and here we are reading what the Poem of Pentaur describes rather than what can be independently verified, presents Ramses calling directly on the god Ammon at the moment of crisis. It describes him fighting with a ferocity and effectiveness that drove back the Hittite forces. It describes him holding the situation through personal action, his officers and soldiers returning to find him already prevailing against odds that should have been impossible. The passage devoted to this moment is one of the longest and most elaborate pieces of royal self-promotion in the surviving record of ancient Egypt. It is vivid and detailed and shaped by what it needed to say rather than by the requirements of accurate reporting. The Hittite sources describe something considerably less triumphant for the Egyptian side. They describe a battle that went in Hittite favour. They describe the Egyptian camp as overrun. They describe the outcome not as an Egyptian triumph interrupted by the arrival of relief forces, but as a Hittite military success that fell short of complete destruction primarily because Egyptian reinforcements arrived in time to stabilize what had become a critical situation. What can we say with reasonable confidence when we hold these accounts against each other? Ramses walked into a trap. The intelligence failure was real and serious. The decision to advance the division of Ammon ahead of the supporting divisions left the division of Ra exposed on the line of march. A tactical error that nearly ended the campaign in catastrophe. The division of Ra was routed. The Egyptian camp was penetrated by Hittite chariotry. During the central phase of the battle, the Egyptian position was genuinely desperate. Ramses did not run. Whatever the precise nature of his personal conduct during those minutes inside a camp that was breaking around him, and the Poem of Pentaur is too clearly shaped by its requirements to be relied on for precise description. He remained rather than retreating. That is worth noting plainly. A commander who stays when staying is dangerous is doing something real, regardless of how that staying was later recorded and distributed. Egyptian reinforcements arrived. Their arrival changed the situation. The Hittite forces did not complete the destruction of the Egyptian army. The battle ended without a clear winner in the conventional sense. Neither side destroyed the other. Ramses did not take Kadesh. The Hittites did not capture the Egyptian pharaoh. Both forces disengaged. Both sides went home. That is what happened at Kadesh, as best as the available evidence allows us to reconstruct it. And then something far more consequential than the battle itself began. The Poem of Pentaur was produced, not written once and filed, not carved into a single wall for the record, carved onto the walls of at least 5 major temples, distributed across the sacred landscape of Egypt with a consistency rarely matched in Egyptian royal propaganda. The same account, the pharaoh calling on Ammon, the pharaoh fighting against impossible odds, the pharaoh prevailing through divine favour and personal courage, encountered by every person who visited any of the most significant religious sites in the country. A battle that had ended in strategic stalemate, that had in fact come dangerously close to ending in catastrophic Egyptian defeat, was being transformed in real time into the defining demonstration of a reign. This is what the phrase architecture of memory actually means when applied to what Ramses II did. Not the physical buildings themselves, though those matter enormously. The architecture of how events are recorded and distributed and embedded in the landscape of a civilization in ways that make them nearly impossible to dislodge from the story told about a person and a time. He did not simply commission a favorable account of Kadesh. He built that account into the walls of temples that would stand for thousands of years, in locations guaranteeing it would be encountered not once but repeatedly, by generation after generation of people who had no other version of events to compare it against. The Hittite version existed, but it was in Hattusa, in a language most Egyptians could not read, in an archive most Egyptians would never visit. The Egyptian version was everywhere. Kadesh happened in a single spring. The record of Kadesh continued for the rest of his 6-year reign and beyond. When we think about what Ramses II truly understood about power, the most important thing to hold on to is this. He seems to have grasped with unusual clarity that the battle and the account of the battle were not the same thing, and he understood which one was worth more. He put his resources accordingly. 16 years passed between the Battle of Kadesh and the document that resolved it. 16 years of neither full peace nor open war. Egyptian forces remained active in Canaan. Hittite authority continued across their territory. There were smaller engagements and ongoing tensions and the persistent background pressure of two major powers sharing a contested region without having formally agreed on the terms of that sharing. Neither side had achieved at Kadesh what it needed. The fundamental question of where Egyptian influence ended and Hittite influence began remained open, and open questions between empires tend to produce costs in men and resources and strategic distraction that accumulate whether or not either side is actively seeking another major confrontation. The formal resolution came in what scholars believe was around 1250, 8 BCE, when Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusa III agreed to a peace treaty. Before examining the document itself, the circumstances that produced it matter for understanding what it actually was. Hattusa III had come to the Hittite throne through internal political difficulty, a succession crisis that had occupied Hatti with its own problems during the years following Kadesh. More significantly, the Hittite Empire during this period was facing growing pressure from Assyria to the east. Assyrian power was expanding. Assyrian ambitions were increasing. The Hittite eastern frontier was a source of genuine strategic concern that required attention and resources. Maintaining sustained confrontation with Egypt in the west while managing a serious Assyrian problem in the east was a position that Hatti could not indefinitely sustain. Egypt had its own reasons to welcome stability. The campaigns in Canaan and the Syrian region were not cheap. The inconclusive outcome of Kadesh had not resolved the underlying territorial question, and another major campaign to try to settle it would require mobilization on the scale of 1270. 4 BCE with no guarantee of a better outcome. Ramses II had spent 16 years presenting Kadesh as a triumph. Transitioning from that claimed triumph to a formal peace was diplomatically smoother than acknowledging the actual military stalemate the battle had produced, and then explaining why another enormous campaign was necessary. Both sides needed this agreement for real reasons that had nothing to do with either side's dominance over the other. The treaty was a practical solution to a practical problem shared by two empires that had more pressing concerns than continuing to contest the same disputed corridor between them. What makes this agreement remarkable in the context of ancient history is the form it took and what has survived of it. It is one of the earliest known peace agreements between major powers for which versions from both parties exist, written in the languages of both sides, preserved independently in sources that neither controlled. The Egyptian version was carved onto temple walls at Karnak and at the Ramesseum. The Hittite version was recorded on clay tablets and stored in the royal archives at Hattusa, where they remained buried for more than 3,000 years until excavations in the early 20th century brought them back into the light. A replica of the treaty was later given to the United Nations and is displayed today in the hallway on the second floor of the conference building, near the entrance to the Security Council chamber. A document negotiated between two empires in the 13th century BCE now hangs near the room where the 21st century attempts to manage international conflict. The two versions agree on the broad framework of what was settled. There would be peace between Egypt and Hatti. The two kings recognized each other as equals. There would be mutual defense provisions, each party agreeing to assist the other if attacked by a third power. There would be arrangements covering the return of fugitives who crossed from one territory to the other. The settlement would bind the heirs of both rulers, but the two versions are not identical. They diverge in ways that are revealing. The Egyptian version frames the agreement in ways that present Ramses the Second as the party extending terms from a position of strength. The language around which side initiated the peace process, which king sent the first proposal, is handled in the Egyptian account in ways that give primacy to Egypt. The treaty reads, from the Egyptian side, like something Ramses graciously agreed to. The Hittite version frames the same agreement differently. Hattusa III appears in it as an active and equal agent, a king making a strategic decision that serves Hittite interests, not a supplicant accepting terms from a dominant neighbour. The Hittite account does not read like surrender. It reads like statesmanship. Both versions were shaped by the same basic requirement. Each side needed the treaty to look to its own court and its own population and its own sense of royal dignity, like a product of strength rather than necessity. Each side was managing a domestic audience with different needs. The Egyptian court needed to understand that the peace confirmed Egyptian power. The Hittite court needed to understand that the peace served Hittite interests. Both things could be true simultaneously. And the two versions of the same document are the evidence that both sides understood this and acted accordingly. This is one of the most interesting things the treaty reveals. Not the specific terms, which are straightforward enough, but the way both sides used the same agreement to tell different stories about it to different audiences. It is an early and remarkably well preserved example of something that has characterized international diplomacy in every period since. The public version of an agreement and the strategic reality that produced it are not the same thing, and managing the gap between them is part of what agreement making between major powers actually involves. After the treaty was signed, correspondence continued between the two courts. Letters passed between Egypt and Hatti, covering matters of practical cooperation and ceremonial exchange. Some years after the treaty, Ramses II married a Hittite princess, the daughter of Hattusa III, in a union that both courts treated as a formal expression of the alliance. The letters from Hattusa to Ramses that survive in the Hittite archive are written in a register that scholars have described as notably direct, even familiar. They are not the letters of a subordinate addressing a dominant king. They are the letters of a ruler who considers himself an equal, raising practical issues and expecting practical responses. Addressing Ramses as his brother in the diplomatic convention of the period, the picture that emerges from this correspondence is not the picture the Poem of Pentaur wanted to create. It is not the picture of a pharaoh whose power had so overwhelmed the Hittite Empire that its king had no option but to seek terms. It is the picture of two capable rulers managing a relationship between two substantial powers who had fought to a strategic draw and then made the sensible decision to stop fighting and find a way to coexist. That is a genuinely interesting story, in some ways more interesting than the official version. A man who wins a clear victory over a clear enemy is impressive in a way that is easy to understand. A man who walks into a trap at Kadesh, nearly loses everything, claims victory anyway, and then negotiates a practical peace with the enemy he claimed to have defeated, managing all of it without losing the confidence of his own court and population for the remaining 50 years of his reign. That man is something harder to categorize. He is also, considered honestly, considerably more interesting. The stone at the Ramesseum still shows the official version. The clay tablets from Hattusa show the other side, held together. They show something that neither alone could reveal. Two men who needed the same thing, and found a way to get it without either of them having to say so out loud. There is a temple at Luxor that has stood on the east bank of the Nile for more than 3,000 years. It was not built by Ramses II. Construction at Luxor began under Amenhotep III, a pharaoh who ruled more than a century before Ramses was born, and was continued by subsequent rulers before the 19th dynasty came to power. By the time Ramses II arrived with his architects and his plans, Luxor was already an ancient and significant religious site, carrying the accumulated weight of a century of royal investment and sacred association. When he left, it bore his name at the entrance, before you reached anything else, before you encountered the work of the pharaohs who had built the core of the temple. You encountered Ramses, colossal statues of him flanking the gateway, a large court added in his name, obelisks carved with his titles, his presence established at the threshold so that whatever came after was encountered in the context of having first passed through him. This was not the only place. The practice that Egyptologists describe using terms including usurpation, monument, appropriation, and cartouche replacement was not invented by Ramses the Second. Egyptian pharaohs had been placing their names on older structures and in some cases replacing earlier cartouches with their own, for as long as the tradition of monumental inscription existed. It was a recognized feature of Egyptian royal culture, connected to ideas about the living relationship between a reigning king and the sacred sites of the kingdom, about what it meant to claim a temple or a monument as part of one's own royal and religious identity. But Ramses II did it on a scale that stood apart. Scholars who have spent careers examining the physical surfaces of Egyptian monuments, comparing what documentary sources suggest was originally present with what the stone actually shows, have documented a pattern of name replacement and monument appropriation that was systematic and extensive. The evidence at Luxor is among the clearest. At Karnak, where the complexity of interventions from dozens of different reigns makes the picture harder to read, his contributions and appropriations are substantial. Across sites from the Nile Delta into Nubia, his name appears in ways and on surfaces that detailed examination identifies as involving the modification of earlier material. He also built from nothing on a scale that no pharaoh before him had matched. Ramses, the new capital he constructed in the Nile Delta, was created from essentially nothing, a city designed from the beginning to bear his name and serve as the center of Egyptian administrative and military life for the duration of his rule. The Ramesseum on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes was a mortuary temple of genuine ambition, built to a scale intended to communicate the magnitude of his reign to everyone who encountered it. Abu Simbel, which we will come to in the next chapter, was something else again. He had enough. He had built enough to have secured his place in Egyptian history without placing his name on a single monument he had not constructed himself. The temples were real. The city was real. The construction programs were real and extensive and of genuine quality, and yet he placed his name on many monuments he had not built. How to understand that behavior honestly requires holding two different interpretations at once, because neither alone is sufficient. The first interpretation comes naturally to a modern reader. It looks like a form of dishonesty, taking credit for what others built, pressing a name onto surfaces that carried the records of earlier reigns. In the terms we would use today, it resembled falsification, but Egyptologists who have spent the most time with this material tend toward a more careful reading. Usurpation in ancient Egypt was not always understood the way we would understand it now. The relationship between a reigning pharaoh and a sacred monument was not the same as ownership in a modern legal sense. When a pharaoh placed his name on an existing temple, he was not necessarily claiming to have built it. He was claiming a living relationship with it, incorporating it into the network of divine kingship that he embodied, making it part of the sacred geography of his reign. This could be understood as a form of consecration as much as appropriation. Some specific cases of name replacement were also connected to the political project of erasing the memory of rulers who had been declared illegitimate. The Amarna period pharaohs, whose religious reforms had been repudiated and whose memory was being systematically removed from official contexts beginning under Horemheb, are the clearest example. Replacing those cartouches was not the same kind of act as replacing the name of an uncontroversial predecessor who had simply been there first. In some cases, practical motivations may have played a role. Stone surfaces already shaped and smoothed and in place were expensive to produce from scratch. Reusing an existing surface by replacing its inscription was not only faster but reflected a relationship to material resources that was simply different from modern assumptions about originality and attribution. All of that is true. It is also true that the scale of what Ramses II did was not typical even within a tradition where the practice existed. The physical evidence at multiple sites makes the pattern difficult to explain entirely as ceremonial reconsecration or administrative practicality. He placed his name where it had not been, repeatedly and systematically, in ways that served the larger project of making his presence felt across every significant physical space in the Egyptian world. The most honest position is to hold both interpretations simultaneously. The practice was culturally legitimate in ways that do not map cleanly onto modern concepts of falsification, and the scale at which he pursued it went beyond what the cultural legitimacy alone fully covers. Both things are true, and the tension between them is the most honest place to stand. What he was doing, at the largest scale, was something more ambitious than adding his name to individual buildings. He was reshaping the landscape of Egyptian memory itself. The Nile Valley was a kind of text, a surface on which the history and identity of Egyptian civilization was written and could be read by anyone who moved through it. When the name Ramses appeared at the entrance to Luxor, when it appeared on monuments from the Delta to Nubia, when it was cut into the cliff at Abu Simbel and built into the streets of a capital city that bore it as its own name, the physical experience of moving through Egypt became the experience of moving through a landscape that declared him at every significant point. That is not simply building. That is not simply putting your name on things. Among the rulers of the ancient world, few came closer to achieving that condition than he did. The condition where a civilization and a single name become so thoroughly fused in the physical experience of a place that separating them would require active effort that most people would never have occasion to make. Whether it was a legitimate expression of royal power within the conventions of his culture, an overreach that went beyond what those conventions sanctioned, or something that existed in the uncomfortable space between those two assessments, is a question the evidence invites but does not settle. What it settles is that the name is still there. There is a cliff face in what is now southern Egypt, near the border with Sudan, that Ramses II chose as the site for two temples cut directly into the living rock, not built in front of it, not built against it, cut into it, carved out of the stone itself, so that the temples and the mountain are the same material, inseparably. The interior spaces existing because rock was removed, rather than because structures were assembled from the outside. The larger of the two temples extends approximately 60 meters back from its entrance into the body of the cliff. The facade presents four colossal seated figures of Ramses, each approximately 20 meters tall, carved from the same rock as the mountain behind them, looking out across the Nile Valley toward the east. Picture standing there in the early morning, before the heat of the day arrives, the river behind you, moving slowly in the direction you came from, the cliff ahead, the four figures emerging from the stone as though the mountain itself had taken the shape of the Pharaoh, the entrance between them leading into darkness that the light outside cannot reach. That darkness was designed to be interrupted twice a year, on dates that fall around the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October. The rising sun aligns with the orientation of the temple in a way designed to send light directly down the full length of the interior corridor and into the innermost sanctuary at the very back of the cliff. The innermost sanctuary contains four seated statues, three of them, the figures of Amun, Ra, Horakti, and Ramses II depicted in his deified form, are reached by the light that travels the full 60 meters from the entrance. The fourth statue, the figure of Ptah, the god associated in Egyptian religious tradition with darkness and the deep structures beneath the visible world, remains in shadow. This does not happen by accident. The orientation of the temple, the angle of the corridor, the precise positioning of the sanctuary and the statues within it, all of this was designed and engineered by people who understood the movement of the sun well enough to build a structure intended to produce this specific effect on these specific days, every year, indefinitely. In the 1960s, the construction of the Aswan High Dam created a reservoir that would have submerged Abu Simbel permanently. an international effort coordinated by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, undertook one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 20th century. Between 1960 and 1968, the two temples were cut apart into large blocks, moved approximately 5 meters higher than their original position, and reassembled on the new site with a concrete dome constructed inside the artificial hill to support the relocated structure. The engineers faced the problem of replicating the solar alignment at the new location. They needed to position the reassembled temple so that the light phenomenon the original builders had engineered would continue to occur. They succeeded. The solar alignment at the relocated Abu Simbel still happens twice a year. The light still travels the full length of the corridor. The three statues are still illuminated while Ptah remains in shadow. The alignment is off by 1 day from the original. The phenomenon now occurs on the 21st rather than the 22nd. Engineers working with modern equipment and the full body of 20th century knowledge could replicate what ancient builders created to within 24 hours. After more than 3,200 years, and despite one extraordinary modern relocation, the temple still does what it was built to do. The question of what specifically it was built to do, and what the two dates were intended to mark, is one where the honest answer requires care. Popular accounts frequently describe the dates as corresponding to the birthday and coronation anniversary of Ramses the Second. This connection has been widely repeated and is not without basis as a traditional interpretation. The scholarly picture is more careful. The specific correspondence between these dates and particular events in his personal calendar cannot be confirmed from surviving sources with the precision the popular version implies. The solar alignment exists and can be observed. The precise connection to specific biographical dates is a traditional interpretation that Egyptologists continue to discuss rather than a settled conclusion. Presenting it as settled when it is not would be a small form of the same over, claiming we have been learning to recognize throughout this story. What can be said without that caveat is that the choice of which statues are illuminated and which is not was intentional and meaningful, placing a deified figure of Ramses among the solar gods, and ensuring that the solar event illuminated him alongside Amun, Ra and Ra, Horakti, while Ptah remained in darkness, was a statement about his divine identity, about where he stood in the sacred order of things, not adjacent to the gods, among them, confirmed by the same light that confirmed them, and the statement was designed to be self-executing. This is what separates Abu Simbel from the Poem of Pentaur and the cartouches and the official accounts. The Poem of Pentaur required someone to read it or hear it read. The cartouches required someone to pass them and recognize them. The official accounts required audiences who received them. Abu Simbel required nothing but the earth continuing to turn. Twice a year the sun rose. The light travelled the corridor. The sanctuary emerged from darkness. The same demonstration, executed with the same precision, regardless of whether anyone was watching, regardless of whether anyone remembered why it happened, regardless of whether the empire that built it still existed. The argument the temple makes does not need a speaker. It is built into the geometry of the building and the path of the sun, and it will continue making that argument, silently and without effort, for as long as the stone holds and the earth turns at the angle it turns. Ramses the Second spent his reign looking for forms of permanence. Stone was permanent. Names cut into stone were permanent. Official accounts distributed across 5 temple walls were more permanent than accounts kept in a single archive. But a temple designed so that the cosmos itself performs the argument, twice a year, automatically, was something beyond permanence in the ordinary sense. It was an attempt to make the claim independent of human memory entirely. Whether it worked depends on what you mean by working. The claim is not believed today in the way it was designed to be believed. The sun rising and illuminating the sanctuary does not cause modern visitors to understand that Ramses the Second was a god among the solar deities. The religious framework within which that demonstration made its original argument no longer exists in the way it once did, but the demonstration still happens. Stand at Abu Simbel in the early morning and watch the light move into the entrance and begin its travel down the corridor toward the sanctuary. and you are watching something that Ramses the Second put in motion more than 3,000 years ago, that has continued, despite one extraordinary modern relocation, across the long span of everything that followed, and that will continue as long as the temple stands and the earth turns. He is not there. Everything he ruled is gone. The language his scribes wrote in required centuries of extraordinary effort to decode after knowledge of how to read it was lost. The gods whose names appear in the sanctuary are no longer worshipped by any living community. But the light comes, it finds the same surfaces it has always found. It does not need to be told. Ramses the Second ruled Egypt for 60. 6 years. Pause on that number before anything else is said about it. 60. 6 years is longer than many human lives. It is longer than most modern governments last across multiple generations of leadership. It is longer than the entire span of many historical periods we treat as distinct eras in their own right. When Ramses the Second finally died, there were people alive in Egypt who had been born during his reign, grown up during his reign, had children during his reign, grown old during his reign, and died before he did. For most of the living population of Egypt at the moment of his death, the idea of a different pharaoh was not a political memory or a living expectation. It was a theoretical concept. He came to the throne as a young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s, sometime around 1279 BCU. He died around 1213 BCE, at an age that physical examination of his mummy suggests was somewhere near 90 years. These numbers carry the uncertainty that ancient chronology always carries, and scholars of Egyptian history discuss the precise figures with appropriate caution. The broad picture is not in doubt. He was pharaoh for a very long time. He was alive for even longer than that. The scale of what he built followed directly from the temporal scale of his reign, and the two compounded each other in ways that are difficult to appreciate without holding both in mind simultaneously. A pharaoh who rules for 10 years can build a temple complex, commission statuary, conduct military campaigns, and leave a mark that subsequent generations recognize. A pharaoh who rules for 60. 6 years, with the full resources of one of the ancient world's most organized states at continuous disposal, can do something categorically different. He can reshape the physical landscape of an entire civilization. He can place his name on enough surfaces that subsequent rulers working for generations to diminish that presence would struggle to make a meaningful dent in it. He also, over 60, 6 years, accumulated a family on a scale that reflected the duration as much as the man. The surviving records indicate that Ramses the Second had at least 8 principal wives during his reign. Nefertar, whose place in this story we will come to in the next chapter. Set-Nofret, who appears prominently in the records as the mother of several of his eventual successors. Others who appear with varying degrees of frequency in the official documentation. He also had secondary wives and concubines. As was standard for Egyptian royal practice of the period, and as the resources of the Egyptian state made possible on a considerable scale, from these relationships came a very large number of children. According to currently accepted scholarly estimates based on surviving records, more than 50 children of Ramses II can be identified with enough specificity to treat them as documented individuals rather than statistical estimates. Some popular accounts extend this number considerably further, but those larger figures are not supportable from the documentary evidence currently available to scholars, and stating them as established fact would misrepresent what the record actually shows. More than 50 documented children is, by any reasonable standard, already an extraordinary number. It meant that during his reign, Ramses II was producing heirs at a rate that filled the Egyptian court with his descendants, placing members of his family in significant administrative and religious positions throughout the kingdom, and creating a biological network of connection between the royal house and the Egyptian elite that would persist long after his death. It also created a problem that became visible only gradually during his reign, and then, after his death, very quickly indeed. The problem was succession, not a shortage of potential heirs. The problem was precisely the opposite. Ramses II outlived many of his own children. This is not surprising given that he lived to approximately 90 years in a world where that age was exceptionally rare, and that many of his sons, born during the earlier decades of his reign, had themselves reached old age before their father died. The prince formerly designated as heir at one point was no longer alive to inherit. A subsequent designated heir also died before the pharaoh. This happened more than once. The man who finally succeeded him was his son Merneptah. Merneptah appears to have been somewhere in his 60s, possibly older. When he came to the throne, he was not a young man stepping into a first major responsibility with decades of rule ahead of him. He was a man who had spent a very long time in the complicated position of being a senior prince in a court organized entirely around a father who simply would not die. He ruled for approximately 10 years after his father's death. Consider what 10 years feels like after 60. 6. The 19th dynasty effectively ended within a generation of Ramses the Second's death. The rulers who followed Merneptah held power for short periods. Some contested, some unclear in their precise relationship to the royal line. A woman named Tuzret, who had served as regent for a young king, ruled in her own right for a period before the dynasty gave way to a new ruling house under a man named Setnakte, founder of the 20th dynasty. The 20th dynasty attempted to restore the stability and ambition of the 19th dynasty's best years. Its pharaohs took the name Ramses, from Ramses III through Ramses XI, reaching deliberately back to the memory of the man who had made that name synonymous with Egyptian royal power. Ramses III, the most capable of this line, faced military threats during his reign serious enough to have ended Egyptian civilization entirely, and the fact that they did not is a testament to his own ability and to the resilience of the state machinery he inherited. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu documents campaigns against peoples arriving from the north and west, the groups that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples, with a detail and a scale that makes clear the existential nature of what was being defended. These were not border skirmishes. They were the same wave of displacement and destruction that was ending the Hittite Empire, collapsing the Mycenaean palace system in Greece, destroying major cities across the Levant, and dismantling the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age within the span of a few generations. Egypt survived, but the Egypt that survived was not the Egypt that Ramses II had ruled. To understand why the system weakened as it did requires holding several factors at once rather than reaching for a single cause. What happened to the post? Ramessid Kingdom was the convergence of pressures building from different directions that arrived together in a period when the state had less capacity to absorb them than it had possessed at the height of the new kingdom. Think of the Eastern Mediterranean in this period as a web of connected systems, each dependent on the others in ways that only become fully visible when the connections begin to fail. Agricultural production across the region had been affected by a series of droughts that the climatic record, drawn from tree rings and ice cores and pollen deposits, documents with increasing clarity. The palace economies of the Bronze Age had no equivalent of modern global supply networks that allow one region's failure to be offset by another's surplus. When the Nile floods fell short of what Egyptian agriculture required, the consequences moved directly through the food systems on which the entire social order rested. In the harbours of the Eastern Mediterranean, trade was also breaking down. Tin, necessary for bronze production, did not exist locally in Egypt or the Levant or Greece. It travelled along routes that required the cooperation and stability of multiple political entities to function. Picture those ships no longer arriving, the warehouses empty, the smiths unable to work, the effects moving through every system that depended on the materials those ships had carried. The peoples that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples moved through this destabilized landscape, adding military pressure to environmental and economic stresses already accumulating. The scholarly conversation about who exactly these peoples were and what set them in motion has continued for generations without a settled conclusion, which honestly reflects the current state of the evidence. What the broader archaeological record suggests is significant population displacement across the Eastern Mediterranean, groups being set in motion by some combination of environmental collapse, political failure in their regions of origin, and the cascading effects of disruption moving through a connected system. Within Egypt itself, the pressures were also internal and had been building longer than the regional collapse alone can explain. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak had accumulated institutional wealth and influence across the entire New Kingdom period to a degree that made it a genuine counterweight to royal authority. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the high priest of Amun was effectively governing Upper Egypt as a parallel power to the pharaoh. The political unity that had characterized the New Kingdom at its height had fractured in ways that would require centuries to fully restore. The responsibility for this trajectory cannot be placed directly on Ramses II. The forces driving the Bronze Age collapse were regional and in some cases global, operating on scales that no individual ruler's decisions could have significantly altered. The institutional pressures that became acute after his death had roots extending through the entire New Kingdom period and well beyond his reign specifically. But there is something worth observing about the particular character of what he left behind. Held as an inference rather than a conclusion, a system organized around the overwhelming personal presence of one individual, where that individual's identity and the identity of the kingdom had been fused over 6 years of construction and name, placement and commissioned self, celebration, may have faced a particular vulnerability when that presence was gone. The monuments remained, the temples stood, the name was everywhere, but the coherence that had bound all of it together had been bound so closely around one man that his absence left a structural uncertainty. The institutions around him may have had fewer opportunities to stand apart from the royal project during those 6 years, and fewer still to develop the independent strength that managing such an absence would require. When the wave of regional crisis finally reached Egypt, it found a kingdom navigating pressures from multiple directions simultaneously, some external and some already present from within. What can be stated without that qualification is the contrast that the surviving record produces. The stone lasted, the name lasted, the memory lasted, in ways we are still tracing 3,000 years later. The political continuity did not last in the same way. He built things designed to be permanent. Some of them were more permanent than anything he could have imagined. Others proved to be less permanent than the stone they were built from, for reasons the stone itself could neither prevent nor record. Among everything Ramses II built during 6 years on the throne, there is one thing that stands apart from everything else, in a way that the usual explanations do not fully cover. At Abu Simbel, cut into the same cliff face as the great temple that expresses his divine identity on a scale designed to overwhelm, there is a second temple, smaller than the first, but not small. Its facade presents 6 standing figures carved from the rock, 4 of them depicting Ramses II and 2 depicting a queen. The figures of the queen are the same height as the figures of the king. This was unusual. In Egyptian royal art, royal wives were typically depicted at a much smaller scale than their husbands, a visual convention reflecting the understood hierarchy of their respective positions. The convention was not absolute, but departing from it required a deliberate choice. At Abu Simbel, the 2 figures stand at equal height. Someone decided that was how it should be. The queen depicted there was Nefertari. She was the first and most prominent of Ramses II's principal wives, the queen whose name appears most frequently alongside his in the official records of the earlier part of his reign. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes is considered by many Egyptologists to contain some of the finest painted decoration of the entire New Kingdom period. The paintings show Nefertari in the company of gods, moving through the afterlife with a presence and a dignity that the artists who created them clearly understood how to convey. After more than 3,000 years in the dry heat of the Egyptian desert, the colours retain a quality that photographs approach but do not fully capture. The inscription on the facade of the smaller temple contains language that Egyptologists have noted as unusual within the conventions of Egyptian royal dedication. It is typically translated in terms that convey something like the idea of a woman for whom the sun shines, or a woman the sun rises to honour, though the exact rendering varies depending on which scholar is working with it and which aspects of the Egyptian original they are emphasizing. What is consistent across different scholarly readings is the register. It is personal in a way that Egyptian royal inscription rarely is. It reaches toward an individual rather than a title, toward a specific person rather than the conventional language of royal relationship. In the tens of thousands of inscribed lines covering the walls of his temples and monuments, in a body of official documentation spanning 6 years and dozens of major sites, this register appears almost nowhere else in connection with any of his other relationships. This is the place in the record where something different is visible. What to make of it requires holding two possibilities at once, because the evidence does not resolve them cleanly into one. The first possibility is that the temple represents something genuine, that in the context of a reign spent performing royal identity for the widest possible audience, Nefertari was the person for whom that performance was modified or suspended in some way. That the inscription on the facade is the closest the official record comes to expressing something that was not primarily strategic or calculated. That Ramses the Second, who spent 6 years managing the distance between himself and everyone who encountered him, found in this one relationship something that the standard language of Egyptian kingship was not quite designed to hold, and that the temple at Abu Simbel and the equal height figures on its facade are the result of his attempt to express it anyway within the conventions available to him. The second possibility is that the temple was itself a sophisticated act of political communication, that elevating a principal queen to the status of a figure with her own divine temple served specific functions in the management of the royal court and the royal image, that it communicated things about the stability and sacred character of the royal household that were useful to communicate, that the personal, sounding language of the inscription was a carefully chosen rhetorical strategy rather than an unguarded expression. These two possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A man can do something for strategic reasons and also mean it. The fact that building a temple for Nefertari served political purposes does not automatically mean it expressed nothing personal. The two things can coexist, and in a man of Ramses the Second's evident complexity, they very likely did. What is interesting is that the ambiguity exists at all, in a body of official documentation as large and as carefully managed as what this pharaoh left behind, in a record systematically shaped to present a particular image across 6 years. Finding a place where the record does not resolve cleanly into the expected categories is itself a form of information. It tells you that the man behind the monuments was not entirely contained by them, that there was something in his experience that the machinery of official presentation, for all its scale and sophistication, did not fully absorb. Nefertari appears to have died sometime in the middle period of his reign, probably around his 24th or 25th regnal year. Though the evidence for the precise timing is not conclusive, she disappears from the official records after a certain point. The tomb prepared for her in the Valley of the Queens was prepared with care and at considerable expense, suggesting a burial treated as significant rather than routine. After her death, other queens appear more prominently in the documentation. Isetnofret became more visibly in the official record, in a practice unusual in Egyptian royal tradition, though not entirely without precedent. Several of Ramses II's own daughters were elevated to the position of principal wife during the later decades of his reign, but the temple at Abu Simbel was not built for any of them. It was built for Nefertari, built at the same site as the most complete expression of his divine identity, built to stand beside it indefinitely, so that anyone who came to Abu Simbel to encounter the solar temple and the colossal statues would also encounter, in the same place and in the same light, the temple he built for her. The inscription says the sun shines for her, or rise for her, the translation varying, but the direction consistent, whether the proximity of the two temples deepens the meaning of that inscription, or simply reflects the geography of the site where both were built during the same period, is something the surviving evidence does not settle. What we can say is that the result, whatever the intention behind it, places the two buildings in a relationship that the landscape enforces regardless of what the builders had in mind. At this distance, the most honest thing available is to sit with the ambiguity rather than resolve it prematurely. In a story shaped throughout by a man who is expert at controlling what the record showed, the one place where the record does not look entirely controlled is worth dwelling on carefully. not because it reveals a hidden Ramses beneath the official one, but because it suggests that the official one was not the whole of him, and that suggestion, held with appropriate uncertainty, is more interesting than either a clean confirmation or a clean denial would be. Let that sit quietly for a moment before the next part of this story begins. There is a question that follows Ramses II through every popular account of his reign, surfacing in documentaries and museum exhibitions and conversations that begin with ancient Egypt and arrive, sooner or later, at the same place. Was he the Pharaoh of the Exodus? It is worth spending real time with this question, not because the answer is simple or settled, but because the way we approach it matters, both for what it reveals about the historical evidence and for what it reveals about the difference between kinds of knowledge that do not operate by the same rules and should not be made to compete as though they do. The story of the Exodus, as recorded in the Hebrew Bible, describes the enslavement of the Israelite people in Egypt, their liberation under the leadership of Moses following a sequence of divine plagues that afflicted Egypt, and their departure toward the land promised to them by their God. It is one of the foundational narratives of the Abrahamic religious tradition, central to Judaism, formative for Christianity, referenced within Islam. For hundreds of millions of people, it is not primarily a historical claim to be evaluated against archaeological findings, but a statement of sacred identity, of the relationship between a people and their God, that exists in a register different from ordinary historical inquiry. That difference matters for how to talk about this honestly. Holding it clearly does not diminish the question. It clarifies what kind of question it actually is. The popular identification of Ramses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus rests on two main arguments. The chronological argument connects his reign with dates some scholars have proposed for the events the biblical text describes. The geographical argument points to Pi, Rames, the capital city he built in the Nile Delta, as a plausible location for the city of Ramesses, mentioned in the biblical text as a site where Israelite laborers worked. These connections are not arbitrary. They are the reasons the identification has been made and repeated across decades of popular history, and they deserve to be understood as real reasons rather than dismissed. But the evidence supporting the identification is weaker than its ubiquity in popular accounts suggests. The Egyptian documentary record from his reign does not mention Moses. It does not describe a series of catastrophic plagues affecting the kingdom. It does not record the departure of a large enslaved population from Egyptian territory. It does not describe a military pursuit into the desert that ended in the destruction of a significant Egyptian force. These are not small omissions. Egyptian scribes recorded military defeats and natural disasters and administrative problems, often with careful framing, but with a degree of honesty about difficulty that the existence of the Kadesh source record already demonstrates. The complete absence of any Egyptian documentation corresponding to events of the scale described in the Exodus narrative is a significant evidential problem for the historical version of the story. The archaeological record presents similar difficulties. Extensive excavation and survey work in the Sinai Peninsula, in the regions of the eastern Nile Delta, and in Canaan has not produced physical evidence of a large scale migration of the kind the Exodus narrative describes occurring during the period associated with his reign. This is not a matter of insufficient effort. The relevant regions have been carefully worked by archaeologists specifically interested in this question. Across many decades and from multiple scholarly traditions, the absence of physical evidence is not conclusive proof that nothing happened. Absence of evidence and evidence of absence are not the same thing, but it is what the physical record currently tells us. And representing it honestly requires saying so clearly. This conclusion is not the product of scholars hostile to religious tradition. Many of the Egyptologists and biblical archaeologists who have examined this question most carefully have done so with genuine respect for the traditions involved and have arrived at the same assessment from a range of personal commitments. The mainstream scholarly position that the archaeological and documentary evidence does not currently support a mass exodus of the kind described in the Hebrew Bible during his reign, or during any other period for which comparable Egyptian evidence exists, reflects a broad consensus rather than a particular ideological orientation. What the record does contain is worth knowing precisely because it is more nuanced than a simple absence. The Nile Delta during the 19th dynasty was home to populations of Semitic-speaking peoples whose presence is documented in Egyptian administrative records. Some of these people appear in administrative contexts that involve labor obligations, working on construction projects and agricultural operations organized by the Egyptian state. The presence of Semitic laborers in the Delta during his reign, including at or near the site of Ramses, is a documented fact. It does not confirm the Exodus narrative, but it does place people of the relevant background in the relevant location during the relevant period. The connection is real even if what it connects remains uncertain. The Merneptah Stele provides a different and particularly important anchor point. This inscription, produced during the reign of his son and successor Merneptah, dates to around 1208 BCE and records a military campaign in Canaan. In the course of listing the peoples and territories encountered, it contains a reference to Israel. The specific line, in the most widely accepted scholarly translations, conveys something like the idea that Israel has been laid waste and has no seed remaining. The precise translation of certain terms continues to be discussed, but the identification of the name as Israel is not seriously disputed among scholars who work with this material. This inscription is the earliest surviving written reference to Israel as an entity in Canaan. The grammatical form in which the name appears suggests that the Egypt of Merneptah's time understood Israel as a people or a tribal grouping in Canaan, rather than as an organized territorial kingdom, but it confirms that by the end of the 19th dynasty, there was something in Canaan that Egyptian sources recognized and named as Israel. The honest position, the one the available evidence actually supports, is something like this: a large-scale exodus of the kind described in the Hebrew Bible, involving a massive enslaved population, catastrophic plagues visible across the entire kingdom, the destruction of an Egyptian military force, and a dramatic departure that left no trace in the Egyptian documentary or archaeological record, is not supported by the current state of the evidence. That does not mean nothing happened. Populations move. People leave places. Smaller groups of Semitic people left Egypt under various circumstances during various periods, and some of those movements may have contributed, across generations of retelling and elaboration, to the traditions that eventually crystallized into the Exodus narrative as we have it. But the specific events at the specific scale described in the text do not currently have the documentary or archaeological support that would allow a historian to treat them as established historical events. For religious traditions in which the Exodus is not primarily a historical claim, but a statement of sacred experience and divine relationship, this archaeological situation may simply be beside the point. The Exodus as a story of liberation and covenant does not depend for its religious meaning or its spiritual power on the ability of archaeologists to find corresponding physical deposits in the Sinai. These are different kinds of truth, operating in different registers, and insisting that they must compete with each other misrepresents what both the historical inquiry and the religious tradition are actually doing. Ramses the Second may have been the Pharaoh the biblical narrative has in mind. He may not have been. The evidence does not allow a confident conclusion in either direction. What it allows is a clear account of what we know and what we do not know, a clear separation of the documented from the inferred from the unknown, and an honest acknowledgement that some questions at the intersection of history and faith do not resolve in the way that purely historical questions resolve. That is not an evasion. It is the most accurate thing that can be said. And in a story shaped throughout by a man who was himself extraordinarily skilled at managing the gap between what happened and what the record said happened, honesty about the limits of what we can establish seems like the appropriate place to stand. There is something quietly fitting about that. The Pharaoh who controlled almost every account written about him, encountering a question that no account he controlled can settle. In the summer of 1880, a discovery was made in a cliff, side cache near Deir el Bahari on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, that changed what was known about the physical remains of ancient Egyptian royalty inside the cache, which had been known to a local family for some years before Egyptian authorities were informed. were the mummies of more than 40 individuals. They had been placed there during the 21st dynasty, several centuries after the deaths of the people they contained, by priests responding to a wave of tomb robberies that had left the royal burials of the New Kingdom dangerously exposed. Rather than allow the bodies of the great pharaohs to be destroyed by thieves seeking the valuables buried with them, the priests had gathered the mummies from their original tombs, removed most of the remaining burial goods, and hidden them together in a single location where they remained, undisturbed, for approximately 3,000 years. Among them was Ramses the Second. Picture that for a moment. The man who had spent 66 years making himself impossible to ignore, who had placed his name on more stone than almost any pharaoh before him, who had built Abu Simbel into a cliff face so the sun itself would confirm his divinity twice each year, who had covered the walls of 5 major temples with the account of his own greatness at Kadesh, lying in the dark of a hidden cache for 3 millennia, not because he had been forgotten, because the priests who honoured him had hidden him there to keep him safe. There is something in that image that resists easy categorization. The most visible man in Egypt, hidden in the dark to survive, he was transported to Cairo following the cache's discovery, where he was housed at what is now the Egyptian Museum and examined by successive generations of scholars who extracted increasing amounts of physical information about who he had been during his lifetime. In 1976, the mummy was transported to France. Egyptian authorities had determined that deterioration was occurring at a rate that required intervention, and an arrangement was made with French scientists to conduct a thorough examination and implement conservation measures. The mummy arrived in Paris and was received with a formal ceremony, treated with the protocol extended to a visiting head of state. A story about this journey has circulated widely in popular accounts of his reign. It holds that Ramses the Second was issued an Egyptian passport for the trip, with his profession listed as king. Deceased. The story has a quality that makes it feel true, capturing something real about the strangeness and wonder of a situation in which a pharaoh dead for more than 3,000 years is being transported across international borders. Fact. Checking organizations including AFP Factual have examined the images of this passport that circulate online and concluded that they are reconstructions rather than photographs of an actual issued document. The specific details of the story appear to derive from a retelling of the event rather than from verifiable documentation. What is verifiable is this. The mummy arrived in Paris. The reception included formal honours. French scientists conducted examinations and implemented conservation work that was published, and that substantially advanced what was known about his physical condition at the time of his death. He was returned to Egypt. The conservation extended what had already been a remarkable degree of physical preservation across more than 3,000 years. Now set aside the anecdote. What the examination actually found matters far more than any story about travel documents. Go back to Abu Simbel for a moment. Go back to the 4 colossal figures on the facade, each approximately 20 meters tall, carved from the same rock as the mountain, looking out across the Nile toward the east. The figure of Ramses in those statues is a man of perhaps 30 years, idealized in the conventions of Egyptian royal representation, upright and powerful and symmetrical. The figure does not show time. It does not show weight or wear or the accumulation of decades. It is a statement about what a pharaoh is, not a portrait of what this particular man looked like on a particular morning. Go back to the reliefs at Kadesh. The pharaoh in his chariot, larger than everyone around him, his arm extended in the posture of a warrior in complete command, his posture perfect, his form exactly as it should be for a man in his mid-20s, at the apex of physical capability. Now, place alongside all of that what the examinations of his mummy showed. He had severe arthritis. The joints of his hips and his spine were affected to a degree that would have made ordinary movement increasingly difficult and painful during the later decades of his life. Walking across a room in the final years of a 90-year life would not have been simple. The upright posture that the statues present as his natural condition was, in the physical reality of his last decades, something his body was working against rather than expressing naturally. He had severe dental disease. His teeth were significantly worn, with multiple abscesses, conditions that would have caused chronic pain throughout the later part of his life, and that in a body managing other systemic stress may have contributed to broader health problems through mechanisms that even ancient Egyptian medicine could not have addressed. He showed evidence of atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of the arteries associated with cardiovascular disease, which at his age would have been advanced and systemic. His circulatory system in his final years was not the system of the man charging across the battlefield at Kadesh. Examination also identified evidence consistent with a parasitic infection of a kind common in the Nile Valley environment. Though the specific interpretation of this evidence has been discussed among scholars and should be held at a corresponding level of tentativeness rather than stated as confirmed fact. The picture that emerges is of a body that had accumulated the physical history of approximately 90 years of life, in a world that had no means of managing the conditions that accumulate across that span. The man in the statues at Abu Simbel does not age. That is the point of the statues. The man in the mummy aged in ways that would have been visible and limiting and, toward the end, probably severe in their effects on his daily experience. The bent spine, the joints working against him, the teeth that had been destroying themselves for decades, the arteries narrowing year by year, both of these things were Ramses the Second. The stone version and the physical version, the image built to last forever and the body that was finishing its work. He succeeded, more completely than almost any human being who has ever lived, in making the record of himself outlast the physical reality. The image is what most people who think about him think about. The colossal figures, the temple at Abu Simbel, the name everywhere, the solar alignment, the version he built. The mummy was transferred in 2020, one to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, where it is now housed. As part of a ceremony in which royal mummies were transported through the streets of the city with considerable formality, it is available for examination by scientists and for viewing by visitors. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the part of Ramses the Second that the stone could not be. The stone says, "I am beyond time." The mummy says, "I was 90 years old and my joints were destroying themselves and my teeth were gone and my arteries were hardening and I lived longer than almost anyone I had ever known, and the body that housed everything I did, everything I built and everything I was is now this." Both statements are true, held together. They form the most complete portrait of him that the evidence allows, the version he chose, and the version time kept regardless of what he chose. Merneptah was not a young man when he became pharaoh. That single fact tells you more about the situation Ramses II left behind than almost anything else could. In a functioning system of royal succession, the designated heir arrives at power with enough life ahead of him to consolidate his own authority, manage the transition from his predecessor, and shape the kingdom according to his own priorities. Merneptah had none of that available to him. He was somewhere in his 60s, possibly older, a man who had spent decades waiting in one of the more difficult positions that ancient court life could produce. Senior prince in a court organized entirely around a father who simply would not die. Designated heir to a kingdom whose king had already outlived most of the men who had expected to succeed him. He ruled for approximately 10 years. Consider what 10 years feels like after 60. 6. By ancient standards, 10 years is not nothing. Merneptah was not an incapable ruler. He conducted a significant military campaign in Canaan that produced the stele bearing his name, the inscription we examined in the previous chapter that contains the earliest surviving written reference to Israel. He dealt with Libyan incursions against Egypt's western borders with what the surviving sources suggest was reasonable effectiveness. He managed the administrative machinery of a complex state through a period that was already showing signs of the regional pressures that would define the following century. But 10 years of reasonable competence cannot address what 6 years of concentrated personal authority had produced. The institutional structures of the Egyptian state, the priesthoods, the military, the administrative networks, the regional officials and their webs of local connection. He had spent 6 decades operating in the shadow of a pharaoh whose personal dominance was so complete that the institutions around him may have had fewer opportunities to stand apart from the royal project and develop the kind of independent strength that managing a major transition would require. When that dominance ended, the institutions did not smoothly step forward and fill the space. What stepped forward instead was competition. After Merneptah's death, the 19th dynasty entered a period that Egyptologists describe with careful language, because the surviving evidence for exactly what happened is incomplete and sometimes contradictory. There were multiple claimants. There were pharaohs whose reigns lasted only months. A woman named Tuzret, who had served as regent for a young king, ruled in her own right for a period before the dynasty gave way to a new ruling house. A man named Setnakhte came to power as the founder of the 20th dynasty under circumstances the sources describe without fully explaining. And the transition between dynasties appears to have involved a degree of internal conflict that neither set of official sources had strong reasons to document in detail. The 20th dynasty that followed attempted to restore the scale and stability of the 19th dynasty's best years. Its pharaohs took the name Ramses, from Ramses III through Ramses XI, reaching deliberately back to the memory of the man who had made that name synonymous with Egyptian royal power. The invocation was sincere. Ramses III, the most capable of this line, faced military threats during his reign, serious enough to have ended Egyptian civilization entirely. And the fact that they did not is a testament to his own ability and to the resilience of the state machinery he inherited. His mortuary temple at Medinet Habu documents campaigns against peoples arriving from the north and west, the groups that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples, with a detail and a scale that makes clear the existential nature of what was being defended. These were not border skirmishes. They were the same wave of displacement and destruction that was ending the Hittite Empire, collapsing the Mycenaean palace system in Greece, destroying major cities across the Levant, and dismantling the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age within the span of a few generations. Egypt survived, but the Egypt that survived was not the Egypt that Ramses II had ruled. To understand why the system weakened as it did requires holding several factors at once rather than reaching for a single cause. What happened to the post? Ramessid Kingdom was the convergence of pressures building from different directions that arrived together in a period when the state had less capacity to absorb them than it had possessed at the height of the new kingdom. Think of the Eastern Mediterranean in this period as a web of connected systems, each dependent on the others in ways that only become fully visible when the connections begin to fail. Agricultural production across the region had been affected by a series of droughts that the climatic record, drawn from tree rings and ice cores and pollen deposits, documents with increasing clarity. The palace economies of the Bronze Age had no equivalent of modern global supply networks that allow one region's failure to be offset by another's surplus. When the Nile floods fell short of what Egyptian agriculture required, the consequences moved directly through the food systems on which the entire social order rested. Across the harbours and overland routes that connected the Eastern Mediterranean, trade was breaking down simultaneously. Tin, necessary for bronze production, did not exist locally in Egypt or the Levant or Greece. It travelled from distant sources along routes requiring the cooperation and stability of multiple political entities to function. When those routes were disrupted, the effects moved through every system that depended on the metals and materials those routes had carried. Armies without adequate bronze, construction projects that could not be completed, economies that had been built around an exchange that was no longer reliably occurring. The peoples that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples moved through this destabilized landscape, adding military pressure to environmental and economic stresses already accumulating. The scholarly conversation about who exactly these peoples were and what set them in motion has continued for generations without a settled conclusion, which honestly reflects the current state of the evidence. What the broader archaeological record suggests is significant population displacement across the Eastern Mediterranean, groups being set in motion by some combination of environmental collapse, political failure in their regions of origin, and the cascading effects of disruption moving through a connected system. Within Egypt itself, the pressures were also internal and had been building longer than the regional collapse alone can explain. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak had accumulated institutional wealth and influence across the entire New Kingdom period to a degree that made it a genuine counterweight to royal authority. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the high priest of Amun was effectively governing Upper Egypt as a parallel power to the pharaoh. The political unity that had characterized the New Kingdom at its height had fractured in ways that would require centuries to fully restore. The responsibility for this trajectory cannot be placed directly on Ramses II. The forces driving the Bronze Age collapse were regional and in some cases global, operating on scales that no individual ruler's decisions could have significantly altered. The institutional pressures that became acute after his death had roots extending through the entire New Kingdom period and well beyond his reign specifically. To assign primary responsibility to any single factor, or to any single reign, would be to claim a causal precision that the evidence does not support. What can be observed, held carefully as inference, is that a kingdom organized for so long around one overwhelming personal presence may have faced a particular kind of vulnerability when that presence ended. The monuments remained. The temples stood. The name was still everywhere. But what had made all of it cohere was gone, and the structures that might have provided coherence in its place may have had fewer opportunities to develop that capacity during the decades when the royal project had filled every available space. When the wave of regional crisis finally reached Egypt, it found a kingdom navigating pressures from multiple directions simultaneously, some arriving from outside and some already present within. What can be stated without qualification is the contrast that the record produces. The stone lasted, the name lasted, the memory lasted, in ways we are still tracing 3,000 years later. In this story and in the ongoing work of scholars who continue to examine what he left behind, the political continuity did not last in the same way. The 19th dynasty was functionally gone within a generation and a half of his death. The New Kingdom that had reached what looked like its apex during his reign was effectively over within a century and a half. He built things designed to be permanent. Some of them were more permanent than anything he could have imagined. Others proved to be less permanent than the stone they were built from, for reasons the stone itself could neither prevent nor record. We have travelled a long way through this story, from a military family that had to invent its own legitimacy, to a boy riding beside his father through campaigns in Libya and Nubia, learning not just how armies moved, but how power was recorded after it moved, to a young pharaoh approaching Kadesh with more speed than caution and walking into a trap that nearly ended everything, to the Poem of Pentaur carved across 5 temple walls, transforming that near disaster into the defining demonstration of a reign, to a treaty with an enemy that both sides needed and both sides framed as evidence of their own strength, to a name pressed into the landscape of an entire civilization, appearing on surfaces built by others as readily as on surfaces built by his own commission, to a cliff face in the south where the sun performs its demonstration twice each year without being asked, to 6 years and what they left behind, to a woman for whom he built something different, in a place where the record looks different, to an Exodus question that sits at the boundary between history and faith, to a mummy in a museum in Cairo that shows what 90 years did to the body the stone was designed to replace. What does all of that add up to? Not a verdict. That needs to be said directly, because the shape of this story, moving through evidence and assessment toward a final chapter, can create the expectation that a verdict is coming. It is not. The evidence does not support one, and offering a clean conclusion where the material produces only honest complexity would be its own kind of distortion. But complexity is not the same as nothing, and holding contradictions without resolving them is not the same as having nothing to say. Was he great? The question sounds simple, and turns out to be almost unanswerable in its simple form. If greatness means effectiveness, the answer is clearly yes. He ruled for 6 years, which requires a combination of political skill and institutional management, and the ability to maintain the cooperation of enormously complex systems of human organization across a span of time that most people in any era never lived to. Complete. He built on a scale that has lasted 3,000 years. He negotiated a peace that ended a generation of costly conflict. He maintained the basic functioning of one of the ancient world's most sophisticated states across a period that would end several of its contemporaries. If greatness means that his achievements were what he claimed they were, the answer becomes considerably more difficult. He did not run at Kadesh. Whatever the precise nature of his personal conduct in those desperate minutes, he stayed. That is real. A commander who remains in a collapsing situation when retreating would have been easier is doing something that deserves to be acknowledged regardless of how it was subsequently recorded and distributed. He built Abu Simbel. Whatever the full complexity of his motivations, the result is a structure of genuine ambition and genuine precision that has outlasted the civilization that produced it, the empire that surrounded it, the language in which its inscriptions were written, and the religion whose gods occupy its innermost sanctuary. That is a remarkable thing to have made. These achievements exist independently of how he described them, and they coexist with a pattern of over, claiming that the evidence, when read carefully and completely, makes difficult to ignore. The Battle of Kadesh was not the triumph the Poem of Pentaur describes. The monuments bearing his name were not all built by him. The Hittite tablets, the physical evidence of cartouche replacement, the mummy that shows a body the stone was never designed to acknowledge. All of these produce a picture that is wider and more complicated than the official version. A man who over claims can also genuinely achieve. A man who builds propaganda can also build temples that last 3,000 years. A man who controls the record can also be the kind of man who stays in a collapsing camp when running would have been easier. These things are not mutually exclusive. They coexist in this particular life, in the evidence this particular life left behind, and the most honest reading of that evidence holds them together rather than choosing between them. Then there is Merneptah, the temple built at the same site as his greatest monument, with figures of equal height on the facade, with an inscription that reaches toward the personal in a way the rest of his official record almost never does. Whether this reflects something genuine, something strategic, or something that was both simultaneously in proportions we cannot measure from this distance, it stands apart from everything else he left behind. It is the one place in 6 years of carefully managed official documentation where the management does not look entirely complete. That gap between the controlled and the uncontrolled, between the portrait he commissioned and the fuller portrait the evidence produces, is not an absence. It is where he actually lives, 3,000 years later, for anyone willing to look carefully enough to find him. We cannot get all the way to him. 3,000 years is too far. The sources are too managed and too incomplete and too shaped by priorities that were not about truth in the way we would understand it. But we can get closer than the official version wanted us to get, and closer, in this particular case, turns out to be more interesting than the destination the official version was pointing toward. Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote a poem in 1818, 14 lines. A traveller in a desert encounters the ruins of a colossal statue, the shattered legs, the fallen face, half sunk in sand, with a sneer of cold command still readable in the stone. On the pedestal, an inscription. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Around the ruins, the traveller tells us, nothing else remains, only the sand, and the broken stone, and those words attached to something that no longer stands. The connection between Ozymandias and Ramses the Second appears frequently enough in popular history that it has become part of how both the poem and the pharaoh are routinely discussed. Ozymandias was a Greek rendering of one of his throne names, Usermatre, and colossal statuary associated with his reign was known to European travellers and scholars of the period in which Shelley was writing. Whether the poem was directly inspired by him, or whether the connection is more general and the source of inspiration more complicated, is something scholars of Shelley have examined without reaching a settled conclusion. The connection is real enough to be worth noting. It is not settled enough to be stated as simple confirmed fact. What makes the poem matter for this story is not primarily the question of who inspired it. It is what the poem imagines. And what actually happened instead? The empire is gone. The 19th dynasty ended within a generation and a half of his death. The Hittite empire that had fought him to a draw at Kadesh does not exist. The Mycenaean world that was his contemporary does not exist. The interconnected Bronze Age civilization of which his Egypt was the most enduring expression does not exist. Both of these versions are him. The complexity is not a discovery made against his wishes. It is what you find when you read carefully enough. When you hold the stone version and the mummy version together, rather than choosing between them, when you place the Poem of Pentaur alongside the Hittite tablets and ask what the gap between them reveals, he could not have known that 3,000 years later, people would have access to those tablets and the results of modern medical examination of his mummy and the tools of contemporary scholarship and the capacity to sit in the dark with the full weight of his story and hold the contradictions honestly, rather than resolving them into whichever simple version feels most satisfying. He built for permanence. He achieved something stranger than permanence. He achieved a kind of presence that has outlasted not only the empire, but also the simplified version of himself. The empire was designed to project, and that continues to generate attention precisely because there is enough complexity in what he left behind to keep the questions alive. Somewhere in southern Egypt, the cliff is waiting for the morning. The light will come at the angle it always comes. It will enter the temple. It will travel the corridor. It will find the sanctuary and illuminate the three figures and leave Ptah in the dark. Exactly as it was designed to do by people whose names we do not know, working in the service of a name that is still there after everything that has tried to wear it away. No one needs to remember for that to happen. No one needs to tell the story or maintain the tradition or pass the knowledge forward. It happens because the geometry was right, and the stone held and the earth still turns at the angle it turns. He put that in motion more than 3,000 years ago. It is still moving. Let the rooms settle around you now. Let the weight of tonight's journey go slowly. The way stone cools slowly after the sun moves on. You have travelled from the beginning of his story to what passes for its end, which is not really an end because the stone is still there and the light still comes, and the name is still readable by anyone who knows how to read it. The questions that stay open are supposed to stay open. A man who spent 6 years pressing his name into every surface that could hold it, who shaped the record of Kadesh into what he needed it to be, who built a temple so the sun would make his argument twice a year without being asked. That man would understand, perhaps better than anyone, that the most interesting questions are the ones that do not close. The cliff is waiting for the morning. The light will come. It always does. Rest now.